I decided to write this book because I'm a practicing physician and I study patient safety and medical mistakes. And over the last 10 or 15 years, I think it was natural for me and my colleagues to just wait for computers to enter our world and solve so many of our problems. And I think part of the issue was, our iPhones have solved so many of our problems in the rest of our lives and they're so magical. We had this belief that computerization in healthcare would be similarly straightforward. And yet when the computers did enter our world, things didn't quite work out that way. We found that the doctor's notes were bloated and almost sometimes indecipherable. We found that doctors and patients weren't looking each other in the eye anymore. The doctors had their heads down in the computer and patients certainly noticed it. And then about 2 years ago at UCSF where I work, we gave a kid a 39-fold overdose of a common antibiotic. And as I sat there at the meeting where we were discussing it, I said, boy, this is so different than what we expected and what we'd hoped for, and somebody needs to understand it and write about it, and that's why I decided to write the book. I think there are two key fixes to the problems that are emerging in digital healthcare. The first relates to this issue of user-centered design, which is up until now, the computer vendors, the people making the healthcare computer systems, have not sufficiently brought in doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and patients into the design process. And I came to deeply understand how important that is. In researching my book, I spent a day at Boeing headquarters and was privileged to meet with the folks who developed the cockpits of the Boeing commercial jetliners. And those folks would not dream of greenlighting a plane, of sending it out to be used in the commercial market until they had spent thousands of hours watching pilots actually fly the mock-ups of the plane. These are very smart engineers, but they know that unless they watch the pilots use their systems, they won't understand that this thing that seemed like a really good idea on the drawing board, it just doesn't work the way we anticipated. That kind of user-centered design, bringing the frontline users into the process, has not happened sufficiently in healthcare. The second fix that I think is really important is trying to figure out the appropriate role of government. Government has had a unique and interesting role in the history of healthcare IT. It was $30 billion of federal funding over the last several years that got us finally to go digital. It wasn't happening naturally, and the reason that we now are up to 70 or 80% computer adoption is because of government funding. But with that funding came pretty exuberant government regulations, with the governments getting very deeply into the weeds, trying to prescribe what the fonts look like and what the screens look like. And just imagine if the government tried to do that for your desktop or your smartphone. I think enough said. We don't want that. I think the model for the government here is that of the early days of the internet, where the government was extraordinarily involved in the development of the internet, but once the internet was up and running, the government pulled back a tremendous amount, and the internet is really managed privately and by nonprofit organizations. I think the government has a key role in healthcare technology, but the role really is in privacy, in security, and in getting all of the computer systems to talk to each other. That's incredibly important, but beyond that, it's time for government to pull back quite a bit. This is one of those issues. You get a bunch of doctors together and you say to one of them, tell me, how's it going with your computer? And you have pushed a hot button and you'll have a hard time getting people to be quiet about this. Everybody is exercised about it and flabbergasted by how difficult this has been. But I also wrote it in a way to try to speak to patients, and the early feedback I've gotten from patients has been extraordinarily positive and gratifying. I think it does, and I think it's of great interest to patients. First of all, it's an incredibly interesting story. There are vivid characters, incredibly interesting companies, and this is about the digital transformation of arguably the most important industry that we have, the healthcare industry. The second reason I think it's interesting to patients is that patients are wondering what's going on. Patients come in and see their doctor, and they see their doctor cursing out their computer, or they see their doctor with his or her head down in the computer, not looking at them in the eye anymore, and they're wondering what is going on here. And I think will create some positive conversations between patients and their clinicians. The third is probably the most important reason, and that is that it's easy to think that a book about computerization is about the technology, and of course it is a little bit. But it's also now about the way your heart attack is diagnosed, or you are told that you do or you don't have cancer, or you tell us whether you do or you don't want to be resuscitated if you're very ill. I think starting now and lasting until forever, this is the way your healthcare will be managed. And so this really matters deeply to patients. The world of healthcare has transformed from the business that I grew up in and that I was trained to practice in when I went to medical school, which was an analog business, to a completely different industry, digital healthcare. And that matters deeply to patients because it's really about how your healthcare and how your health is managed. The question of whether computers will take over for doctors comes up all the time, and there are people out there making that argument. I can tell you it bugs doctors quite a bit, as it would bug all of you if you spent 10 years training for something and then your work was being taken over by a chip. That doesn't feel good. I think we have to be open and honest about it and say there are parts of what a doctor does today that computers not only will take over, but they should take over. Why should I have to try to remember what medicine you're allergic to, or that these two medicines out of 10,000 might interact with each other, or what the appropriate algorithm to treat high cholesterol is? These are things that can be programmed into a computer, and I think if a computer takes over for the doctors, we'll do better. I think we'll provide better, more reliable care. I think that's terrific. There are other areas where the computers, I think, can be extraordinarily helpful in giving the doctor and the patient enough data to frame a decision. But at the end of the day, these are judgment calls, and I think the decision should still be made by human beings, talking to each other, understanding each other's values and points of view. But there's no question the computers can help frame those issues and provide important information. The part I worry about the most relates to the human connection and empathy. I think when someone goes to plan a trip or buy a book or go out and figure out where they're going for dinner, those are quite transactional, and computers can take over that, and people say, that's fine. But when you come to see me because you're having chest pain or belly pain or worried that you have cancer, that relationship doesn't feel transactional. It feels deeply human and deeply moral. And I think you want a doctor on the other end of that conversation, someone who understands your values, understands your anxiety, listens to you, takes full advantage of all the tools, including the technology, but interacts with you as one human being talking to another human being. And I think if we lose that, if the computers sort of force that out of the system, I think will have lost something extraordinarily important, and it would be a terrible shame. When I started writing the book, I have to tell you, I started out, when I thought about digital healthcare, I was pessimistic. What I was seeing was not good, was disappointing, and there was a part of me that was kind of angry. And I finished the process of writing the book and the process of interviewing about 100 people much more optimistic than I came into it, which was nice. I wondered not just how the book would end up, but how I would end up at the end of the process. And I came out of it pretty optimistic. The other thing that made me optimistic was when I interviewed these 100 people, they had very different answers to certain key questions, like will technology take over for doctors, or has government intervention been good or bad? But then when I asked them, what does this look like when the dust settles? Almost everybody gave me the same answer. And the answer is a really wonderful, hopeful answer. It's patients taking care of themselves with new apps and talking to their doctor through telemedicine. It's using big data in a way that gets past all the early hype and uses it to understand better ways of treating cancer or managing heart disease. And I came to realize that we are going to end up in that place. The key question is how long it takes to get there. And I think those are related to the choices we make. Part of what the book is about is what are those choices? If we make good choices, I think we end up in a really terrific place in a matter of 5 years, 7 years. I think if we make bad choices, and we're making some bad ones now, unless we turn some of those ships around, I think we're looking at more 15, 20, 25 years. And that's a lot of bad things and a lot of people that will die that don't need to if we make the right choices.